For decades, Germany has stood as the undisputed economic anchor of Europe. It's the beating heart of the EU, its largest economy, and a global manufacturing giant, responsible for roughly 1 in 10 of the world's exported goods. The world knew Germany for its reliability, its precision engineering, and its unique economic miracle, which once seemed unbreakable. But this powerhouse is starting to come undone. Germany's economy is now expected to shrink for multiple years in a row. German companies are struggling to remain competitive, and we've seen historic developments like Volkswagen having to consider factory closures in Germany for the first time in its 87-year history. The country looks set to enter its third straight year of recession, with millions of people left without jobs. But instead of simply watching this decline, Berlin is making an enormous bet, a 500 billion euro bet. This is the largest spending package in the country's modern history, worth roughly 15% of its entire GDP. A nation built on prudence and fiscal discipline, a nation that prides itself on never spending more than it earns, this marks a radical break. That principle, famously enshrined in the Debt Brake Constitutional Amendment, has underpinned Germany's success for decades, shaping its reputation as Europe's financial anchor. But desperate times call for desperate measures. If this gamble works, it could reignite not just the German economy, but Europe as a whole. But if it fails, it won't just destroy the reputation Germany has spent decades building, it could drag the entire European economy down in the process. So, how did Germany find itself here? On the surface, Germany seems similar to other developed nations. It has a highly educated population, a strong middle class, and wealthy workers. But at its core, its economic engine is fundamentally different. Usually, when a country's economy grows, it matures by moving away from selling physical products like phones or cars towards services like finance or legal advice. But Germany is the outlier. It still exports huge amounts of sophisticated manufactured goods, mostly selling them to other European countries. Take Wolfsburg, for example, home to one of the largest car factories in the world. That single factory produces more vehicles than entire countries like the United Kingdom or Italy manage in a whole year. Germany accounts for over a quarter of Europe's total manufacturing output. This model worked brilliantly for decades. Exports made up nearly half of its GDP, constantly bringing in more money than the country spent on imports. This surplus money flowed back into the country, giving companies huge amounts of capital to invest, and crucially, providing the government with extra tax revenue. Thanks to this, the government never needed to borrow massive amounts of money to fuel the economic machine. And while this export-heavy method of growth was wildly successful, it wasn't without its own profound risk. If foreign countries suddenly stopped buying German products, the entire model would collapse. Germany was effectively relying on the goodwill and stability of strangers. Rather than trying to mitigate this risk, the German government decided to double down on discipline. In 2009, they passed the Debt Brake, a constitutional amendment that severely limited annual government borrowing. The idea was that by pledging to keep borrowing permanently low, they would bolster investor confidence, driving interest rates down even further. And for a while, this worked. From 2010 to 2019, Germany's GDP grew by almost 25%, outpacing most of Europe. Unemployment plummeted, and they consistently ran trade surpluses of over $200 billion every year, more than any other nation on Earth. By this point, Germany had become synonymous with reliability and precision. It would take a series of unprecedented, massive economic shocks to throw the German economy off track. And starting in 2020, that's exactly what began to happen. First came the pandemic. As countries embarked on months of lockdowns, global trade came grinding to a halt. For any country, this was a challenge, but for Germany, which was uniquely dependent on selling its goods abroad, it was disastrous. German exports fell by about 10% in just a few months, wiping out hundreds of billions in trade revenue. The auto industry was hit especially hard, and car production dropped by nearly a quarter. By the end of 2020, Germany's economy had shrunk by almost 5%, its worst performance since World War II. But just as the country was starting to recover, a second, far more crippling crisis emerged: the Russian invasion of Ukraine. While exports to Russia quickly vanished, the real problem was something much more critical: energy dependency. Prior to the war, over 55% of Germany's gas imports came from Russia. This gas wasn't just used for heating homes. It was vital for powering the enormous industrial complex that drove the economy: the chemical plants, the steel mills, and the car factories. This massive reliance on a single geopolitical supplier was a calculated risk that for decades was embraced by German policymakers. Why? There are three core reasons. First, it was cheap. Piped Russian gas was consistently the lowest cost option available, providing German industry with an unbeatable competitive advantage on the global stage. Second, it was political. Following the Fukushima disaster in 2011, Chancellor Angela Merkel accelerated the timetable for the complete phase-out of all nuclear power, a move that removed a massive chunk of reliable low-carbon energy from the grid. With a simultaneous plan to phase out coal, gas was explicitly chosen as the bridge fuel. Gas power plants can be ramped up quickly to stabilize the grid when wind and solar energy production dips. In effect, Germany's ambitious green transition relied on the unwavering supply of Russian fossil fuel. Third, it was structural. German politicians clung to the belief that the relationship was purely commercial. The idea of change through trade deepened this connection, with German business leaders aggressively lobbying for them. This meant that when Russia weaponized its energy supply, halting gas flows almost entirely, Germany was uniquely vulnerable. Within weeks of the invasion, Russian gas imports collapsed by over 90%. Prices exploded, with industrial electricity costs spiking by nearly 35% in just one quarter. Suddenly, factories across Germany were forced to shut down, not because of a lack of demand, but because they simply couldn't afford to keep the machines running. Slowly but surely, the country's economy fell deeper into recession. Normally, when rich countries face a recession, governments engage in massive spending sprees, a playbook that was followed globally during the pandemic. But Germany couldn't do that. Thanks to Germany's ironclad debt brake, it was locked in a vicious cycle with no easy way of escaping. Even as unemployment soared past 3 million people for the first time in decades, the government was legally barred from borrowing the necessary capital for a proper stimulus. And just when things couldn't get worse, global geopolitical tensions mounted, with the threat of U.S. tariffs on German goods and pressure to dramatically increase defense spending, which would have been fiscally impossible under the old rules. So, with their backs against the wall, Germany finally did the unthinkable. The government effectively ripped up its most sacred rule, the debt brake, and announced the €500 billion spending package, the largest spending spree in the nation's history. This is not just another policy. It is a last-ditch existential bet that Germany can transform itself fast enough to avoid collapse. The investment package can be broken down into two core components, both aimed at correcting the structural weaknesses exposed by the crises. First, infrastructure. Totaling around €300 billion, this money is for critical upgrades. Germany's reputation for efficiency has long masked decades of underinvestment. For example, over a third of Germany's official route bridges are in urgent need of repair, and the country lags far behind its neighbors in broadband access. The new spending plans to expand high-speed rail networks and upgrade digital infrastructure to allow businesses to connect their supply chains more efficiently, aiming to massively boost domestic productivity. Second, the Climate and Transformation Fund. Roughly €100 billion are directly allocated here. This includes plans to build massive offshore wind farms and dramatically increase solar capacity. A five-fold capacity increase is targeted by 2030. The entire goal here is to finally mitigate the effects of the Russian energy weapon. By producing reliable, cheap, domestic, clean power, the government aims to return energy costs to normal levels, giving the manufacturing sector the lifeline it desperately needs. In many ways, this strategy is historically sound. After World War II, Japan poured massive resources into rebuilding its roads, ports, and power stations, leading to 2 decades of nearly 9% annual growth. But Germany faces a different reality. Japan was building from scratch. In a highly developed country like Germany, the gains are smaller, requiring improvement of existing infrastructure rather than building entirely new systems. And crucially, the benefits will take time. The country's own central bank predicts these projects won't substantially boost economic growth until at least 2027. This is where the massive risk comes in. The government must pay huge amounts of extra interest on the debt taken out to fund these projects. They are already expected to spend around €40 billion every year just to service the debt. If markets aren't confident that the investment is going to pay off, that cost will only grow larger. We're already seeing this happen. German long-term bond yields have climbed to multi-year highs. If they climb much beyond this point, the rising interest costs could kill the entire project before it even gets off the ground. In reality, this entire gamble comes down to a question of timing. If the government is able to complete these critical projects, installing green power, upgrading roads in time, it could boost productivity and calm the bond markets, pulling the German economy out of recession. But if the projects are caught up in a string of delays and budget increases, then the cost of the debt may become unsustainable. What makes this moment so important is that it's a complete rethinking of how the German economy operates. For decades, the model was simple: keep government debt low and let the private sector do the heavy lifting, relying on exports to drive growth. That system turned Germany into one of the richest countries on earth, but it also left it dangerously exposed to shocks it couldn't control. Now the government is flipping that model on its head. Germany is positioning itself as the driver of state-led investment, betting that hundreds of billions in public spending can rebuild its economy from the ground up, moving from the anchor of fiscal discipline to the accelerator of structural change. The outcome of this gamble won't just shape Germany, it will serve as a definitive test case for the entire developed world. Can massive state intervention still kickstart growth in advanced economies? Or will it prove that the era of government-led miracles is long gone? The truth is, nobody knows. But what happens in Germany over the next decade could set the tone for economic policy across Europe and perhaps even beyond.